looks like it's 1 o'clock, and I'm magically going to appear in the upper left-hand corner of your computer screen. Hello, everyone. It is so glad, I'm going to say, to see you. I'm looking at the camera. I am thrilled that you all are here, and it looks like we are ready to rock and roll. We're right at the hour. So welcome to Make Giving Feedback Easier. My name is Lisa. I'm one of the trainers here at Bonfire Training, and I will be the person that facilitates the next 30 minutes. If you have any questions or anything, go ahead and pop yourself right into that chat box down there, and Audrey or I will address those questions. So there are all sorts of different things regarding feedback, and I'm going to start with a question. My question to all of you first is this: do you give feedback daily? Do you give feedback daily? So go ahead and just jump into the chat box and say yes or no. Do you do it on a daily basis? A lot of yeses. Yep, very good. All right, so so we've got the trend of yes, which is wonderful. Now I want to expand our thinking about what feedback actually is. Many of us think when it's feedback that I'm actually sitting down and having a conversation with you, and that's really the feedback that we're focusing on. I do want to turn our radars on, though, because feedback can also be just me walking through the department and maybe I've got a frown on my face. That starts giving feedback and starts impacting the environment. And the environment is something that's really key to help people be receptive to your feedback. So what you want to think about is, do I give feedback on a daily basis? Well, verbally, maybe not. What do I do non-verbally? So just keep your radar on for that, because that'll impact when you do give that verbal feedback. So let's jump into a couple of things, and I'm going to start with some good news. Here we go. Good news about feedback is that humans crave feedback. This is such a great thing. As a matter of fact, some research tells us that 65% of the people that were polled in this particular instance wanted more feedback. Now, here's the crazy part, is that we are the ones giving the feedback, and it's important that we help them be receptive and cooperative to the feedback. That's what our task is. How do we help them be receptive and cooperative? So there are a lot of resources out there. There's one called, and this is a book that's one of those great foundational books. It's one of those essentials, and it's called Bringing Out the Best in Others. Thomas Connolly, I believe, is the author, Bringing Out the Best in Others. And one of the things that he talks about in there is that there are 3 different types of feedback. There's positive feedback, there's negative feedback, and then there's zero feedback. And he said the most often given feedback is 0, which is really challenging, because if humans crave feedback, then they'll start making it up themselves. In their mind, they'll start creating that feedback based on that nonverbal feedback that you give them. You know, avoiding me gives me feedback. So it's amazing. My mind will start going to a place of worry, a place where my fears are realized. So what we want to do is make sure that we are actually engaging in feedback and remembering that that nonverbal feedback actually has a lot of influence on the productivity of the people that we're working with, has a lot of influence on them being receptive and cooperative when we do give them feedback. So remember, we want to keep in mind the power of feedback. Now, so never zero. Never zero. We want to make sure that we're engaging in that feedback, and it can be informal and it can be formal, both of those. So let's pop over to our next slide and let's continue our journey. So speaking of that no feedback, here are the consequences of no feedback. And based on some great research, it's talking about lack of motivation. Well, one of the things that we're tasked with leaders is to help people be motivated, help people be willing to do their best. And so if we put off feedback, that's one of those things that we're actually counterproductive regarding their motivation. So we want to make sure that we are giving feedback, because that can influence heavily their motivation. It gives lack of motivation. And then their effort. There's something that many of you have probably heard of, and I hope you have. It's called discretionary effort. Discretionary effort. So it's the exact same thing as like discretionary income. So I have, once I pay my bills, and I have an amount of money that I designate that I can spend on whatever I want. As long as it's like, oh yeah, that looks good, I think I want to buy that. Well, it's the same thing. Every time we come into work, we have effort that we always bring into work. And if the conditions are set right, if the environment is motivating for us, then we'll put in more effort. And what's interesting about human nature is that there's always discretionary effort to spend. It's really interesting as long as the conditions and the environment are set. So with no feedback, we're negatively influencing them spending that effort, being their best. And then low job satisfaction. You know, the saying goes, take care of your employees and they'll take care of your customers. And so if we have low job satisfaction, if people are, are thinking, I really don't like coming in, or boy, there are so many things that I really don't like about my job. If we're engaging more with them, then it really helps with job satisfaction. There is a universal motivator. And actually, there are two of them. And during feedback, you will ignite both of these universal motivators. One universal motivator is the relationship that people have with their leaders, the relationship they have with their supervisors. So giving feedback and having that interaction with them helps to create that relationship, helps to create that trust. It really helps with that job satisfaction. Now, the other universal motivator is progress. Helping people see how they're making progress. Because let's say that someone has low job satisfaction, so they feel like they're not contributing. Well, at that point, they're not going to help themselves be their best. So if we help them see what progress they're making, it is definitely a universal motivator. And again, during feedback times, that's a wonderful opportunity to help people see the progress they're making. So the two universal motivators: the relationship they have with you, their supervisor, their immediate supervisor, and then also progress, seeing that progress that they're making, that their activity is actually going toward accomplishment. So feedback is a great opportunity to ignite both of those universal motivators. So we want to make sure that we're not hitting any of these consequences. We want to make sure we're really engaging in feedback. So continuing on, we're going to look at this. It says the answer is not to heap meaningless praise on your employees, but to criticize constructively and sparingly. Now, those two words are underlined for a reason, because these are two big tips for all of us. So first off, with constructively. So what does constructively even mean? Constructive feedback, constructive criticism. Well, these are the words that it means. It means that it's useful, it's productive, it's helpful, it's positive, it's engaging. Now, there are two sides to this. One is the content of your feedback. Is the content useful? Is the content of your feedback productive? Is the content of your feedback positive? Your content of your feedback engaging? And even if we're giving them corrective feedback, when we look at the word positive, we go, well, how could we make that positive? And we'll talk about that. So that's one thing, the content of your feedback. Is it all those descriptors? Now, the second thing about constructive feedback is this: not only the content, but also how. How do we deliver the feedback? Am I delivering it in a way that helps them be encouraged? Am I delivering it in a way where they see it as useful? What's the environment that I'm setting during that feedback time? So content and how are we delivering it? Both of those things help feed constructive feedback. Now the next word. Next word, sparingly. Bottom line here, too much information can shut people down. It's just too much. They don't know what to do. And we want to make sure that we're really giving them something that will move things forward. And feedback is all about not staying in the present. Feedback is all about moving things forward to something better. And if I'm getting too much feedback, then it starts to shut me down, and that doesn't help me move forward. So both of those things are two tips that are going to start our journey on making feedback easier. So the old saying, less is more. Less is more. So that's what you want to think about when you're thinking about that feedback session. How will I position this? How can I just be very succinct with them? All right, continuing our journey. So here's something about environment, another tip for us regarding giving feedback. It says many good events can overcome the psychological events of one bad one. And you can see what the ratio is. For every one bad thing that happens, 5 good things will help create that healthy environment for them to be receptive and cooperative to the feedback. So think of it as this way. Got these cute little deposits these cute little pigs here that we're making deposits into. So every time I interact with you, whether it's just walking by your desk, how do I look? If I'm actually talking with you, am I depositing into your positive bank and helping to build up those 5 things? Or am I depositing into the negative bank? Now, giving corrective feedback, things that, let's say I'm doing something wrong. And if you come to me and you explain that to me, that's not necessarily going to definitely go into my negative bank, because how do you deliver that feedback could go into my positive bank. And there are all sorts of different things throughout our day at work that are going to influence this negative and positive ratio. For example, if I'm sitting around people that like to complain, or that are a bit of a slacker, and they're not carrying their weight, those type of things will be deposits into my negative bank. And so as a leader, we want to make sure that we have our eyes open for what is happening in the environment. How can I help people be their best on purpose every time? And it's looking at what is the environment regarding that positive and that negative ratio. All right, let's continue on. Now, when we're thinking about feedback, there are 2 points that are really important for you to think about before you even give the feedback. A lot of times what we do is we think about what is it that we're going to say, what's the context of what we're going to say, and there are a couple things that maybe don't get our attention as well, and these are critical to help make that feedback be easier for them to receive, easier for you to facilitate. So here's the first one. Says, what is the intent of the feedback? So why am I even giving this feedback? What's the reason behind it? And here are some just very common reasons. Creating a consistent behavior. So maybe someone is doing something well a few times, but I want to make sure that they recognize the value in that. They do it all the time. So is that the intent of my feedback? Is my intent motivation? And remember, establishing and creating that relationship with you helps with that motivation. So is it an opportunity for you to just sit back and see how things are going? That in itself is an opportunity for you to give feedback, share things, and for them too. So feedback, maybe the intent is that around motivation in your relationship with them. Maybe your intent for your feedback is to correct behavior. It's something that is actually done incorrectly, and let me get them on the right track. So thinking about your intent, what am I trying to accomplish with this feedback? And not looking at just the content of the feedback, but what's the bigger picture? Is there consistency that I want? Is there more motivation I want to impact? Is there something that I want to make sure that, boy, I've seen them do this wrong a few times and we've talked about it. Let me get them back on track. So think about the intent of your feedback. What's the reason? What's that bigger picture? Not just the topic of your feedback. What's that bigger picture? And then here's a second thing for us to consider. So once I think about the intent, then what's my approach? What do I do regarding giving feedback? What do I do more of during that conversation? What do I do less of? So to give you a guide with that, think about these 2 things. Is your approach going to be more developmental because you want to develop them? You want to help create thinking? And that's something really key to think about, is to create thinking in people. That's one of those things that really helps people become their best, helps them be more self-coaching. And self-coaching is a really good thing. And you can see there that the tip is ask more questions to create thinking. Ask more questions to create thinking. So and think about the questions that you're asking. So for example, let's say that I'm coming to you and I'm going to ask you about a certain event or something that's happened, and I start asking questions like this. So Joe, what are some things that happened during that situation? And what did the customer's account say underneath that screen? And those questions are all about me gathering data so I can solve the problem. That is not a developmental approach. If I'm just gathering data, I'm asking questions, and they know the answers to those questions, then I've missed an opportunity to be developmental. So asking questions using a developmental approach is more like this. So Joe, I understand that we have a question going on with this customer's account. So what are some of the options that you see moving forward? What are some ideas you have? What are some things you'd like to discuss with that customer? Now, there's a particular letter that I am using very purposefully to help create thinking, and it's the letter S. The letter S. So when I ask, what ideas do you have? What thoughts do you have? What options? What things might you want to talk to the customer about. I'm asking them really think about this and give me some different solutions. Give me some different options. Give me some different next steps. Because something to remember is that our first idea is not always our best. And so as leaders, we want to help create that thinking for them in a safe environment. And then as you're moving through the conversation, you help narrow down, once they give you the options, you start helping them narrow down which one would be best. So asking great questions that create thinking, that's a developmental approach. Now, then there's the directive approach. It says increase the amount of talking and state the direction. So there are all sorts of different reasons to do this, the directive approach. One of those reasons may be that it's just something small. Maybe they're having you review an email that they're sending, and there are just a few words. It's like, hey, if you added this word, and this word, I think you've got a really powerful message for that customer. So it could be more directive. It's just something small. Now, another way to help determine whether it is developmental or directive approach is this. Are you giving them repeat feedback about the same thing over and over again? Because many times we're going to use that developmental approach when we're giving feedback, because we want to create thinking in them, we want them to be self-coaching, and that helps them think about the questions themselves. So going into the directive is, boy, if they've repeated this behavior over and over again, we've had a variety of questions, let me get a little more directive in my approach. Let me get a little more directive in my approach. So if this is feedback that's going on and on and on, then you want to incorporate more, being more direct, more talking, more sharing examples. Now, here's one thing to think about also, is when you're talking with someone giving feedback, it's usually about three things. And I'll jot this into the chat box really quickly. Their knowledge. So do they know what it is that they're doing? Can they explain it to you? Knowledge is all about that explaining. So that's one area that we give feedback in. Do you even know what to do? And then the second area is skill. So they know what to do. Can they do it? The skill is actually doing it. I can, on a crazy example here, I can explain how to bake a cake, but yeah, don't ask me to, because when I get into the kitchen, things, I'm just like, I'm not the best cook. So explaining and doing can be two really separate things. And then the third thing where you get into a feedback conversation is around this. Their will to do it, that motivation. Do they even want to put the effort in? So when you think about developmental approach and directive approach, there are times for you to stop and think about, what is it that I'm talking about? Their knowledge on something, and if it's knowledge, then that might be more of a directive approach. Because if you ask them questions on knowledge that they don't have, it's going to be hard for them to come up with the answers. If it's something about skill, then maybe you want to take more of a developmental approach. So based on the knowledge that you have about that task, talk to me about what might be your next steps. And then when it comes to motivation, that will, that's really one where you want to ask a lot of questions and really help develop that motivation in them. So there are all sorts of considerations regarding what's the best approach. Is it repeat feedback? Is it on knowledge? Is it on skill? Is it on will? So all sorts of different things regarding thinking about what's my approach. And remember, it begins with what's my intent. What am I trying to accomplish? What's that bigger picture? Not just the content of my feedback, but what's that bigger picture? So let's get into something a little different here. So this is the structure of a feedback conversation. And I'm going to direct your attention to the left side of the screen first. You see where it says open and then body and then close. Now, every conversation that's a great productive conversation has an opening, has a body, has a close. And you want to make sure those are purposeful. So when you walk up to someone or when they walk into you and you see it's an opportunity to give some feedback and you're thinking about developmental or directive, you look at how do we open this. And opening is all about make sure everyone knows what the topic is. Sometimes people can start talking and go, oh, you were talking about that. I thought you were talking about this. So ask some questions, make sure there's clarity on the topic before you jump into the body of the conversation. And you can see here we have ALT, alternate between asking questions, listening, and talking. So asking questions, we've talked a little bit about that. Are you gathering data to solve it yourself, or do you want to develop them? And so you're going to ask questions to create their thinking. And then listening. The bottom line to listening, focus. Be in the moment. Really make sure your distractions are minimized. Resist the temptation to look at your email if you hear the ding. Really stay focused. And then talking. So with the developmental approach, you'll have little talking. You'll just be asking questions to help create that. And then every so often you might interject an idea or a thought and ask them to consider that, give their ideas on that. There's a little bit of talking. The directive approach, more talking, more telling. So the body of the conversation goes through. You narrow in the options if you're doing that developmental approach, and then the close. Now the close, it says ensure there's understanding, and it says ask them to sum it up. So if you are giving me feedback and we've had this great conversation, and then you start summing up the conversation for me, and you say, so Lisa, is that how you see it? And I go, yes, it is. And all you're guaranteed to know is that I know how to say, yes, it is. It's critical to ask me, so Lisa, what are the next steps? What do you see? What are you taking away from the conversation? What's going to be your priority based on the things that we've just discussed? So asking me to sum those things up. That's really important. Very, very important. So that's the structure of the conversation. Now, I have a couple of things that can come up. Pushbacks. So let's say during the conversation you're telling Joe or whomever it might be, or Sally, and you start sharing, here's some information, and they get defensive. They're like, it's not my fault. There are other influences. When that happens, remember feedback. You want to make sure things are moving forward. You want to talk to them about trends. Talk to them about trends. If this is a one-time thing and it's a big thing, then you won't have a trend. If it's something that you have trends, speak to the trends. And a key thing in all these pushbacks is ask them about the choices they had in the situation. So if you're going to talk to me about a situation when I was talking with a customer, say, when you were talking with Mrs. Smith, Lisa, what I heard was X, Y, and Z. And so in that moment, let's talk about all the different options on what you could have said next. So XYZ was one idea. What are some other ideas that you have? What are other choices you had during that? And get them to talk about those choices and then narrow it in. So based on what you wanted to accomplish with that call with Mrs. Smith, what choice would have been a great way to go about it? You're creating thinking. And make sure you're acknowledging them, you're affirming them, encouraging them through the conversation. And again, talking can be used. So if you're trying to develop them, create thinking, remember you can interject and talk and ask them to consider, what if you asked Mrs. Smith this? What might have been her reaction? So create that thinking. Now, so choices is huge. Drive them to choices. So what might you have done if we round the tape? And then denial. Yeah, that wasn't me. That was not me. And so again, ask them about choices. So all right, so faced with that information, and also bring any examples in. If they're denying it, say, this is what I've heard about regarding this, this, and this, and makes me think that. And that's why I'm talking to you about this. So bringing in those examples. And again, go to choices. So if you're faced with that same situation, what are different ideas on really what to do next? Again, choices. You want to make sure that you're really going forward with your feedback rather than getting into a conversation where they're nitpicking about things that happen. Move it forward. Get them talking about choices if we did it again. And then lack of desire. Now that's where we get back into that motivation and that will, where they just, I know how to do it, but I just don't want to do it. And that's where you really want to ask some more questions and seek to understand. Those of you that have been through Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, seek to understand others and then be understood. So asking questions. So I have a couple of things for you. I am going to pop into the chat box, and I'd like to get your opinion on this. So if you walk into my office, and I'm going to give you some feedback, we're going to have a feedback conversation. What do you think about me starting this conversation this way? How do you like that? How are you? How are you today? Is that a positive, neutral, or negative way to start that conversation? So just jump in the chat box and put positive, neutral, or negative. Very good. Very good. So the overwhelming feeling, how are you, is neutral. And it can go negative if they tell you to, because sometimes they'll say, well, listen, what's going out on the floor right now, I don't really like this. And all of a sudden, your entire conversation has been hijacked. So it can even go to the negative. And the neutral, when someone comes into your office, they're going to have some emotions. They're going to be curious about, okay, so what's going on? So you really want to go ahead and avoid that question and thank them. Hey, thanks for coming in. I want to talk to you about XYZ. Get straight to the opening. All right, so let me ask you about this. How about this? I thought you understood. How does that feel? Positive, neutral, or negative? Yes, straight to it. Isn't that good? What about this? Why did you do X? Is that positive, neutral, or negative? Absolutely. Now, tone, this is a very interesting thing because tone is king. Oh my goodness, tone has such influence on us being receptive. So I love that tone was brought up. I missed who said that. Thank you for mentioning that. When we say the word why and we're talking about a situation, that does put us on the defensive. So it's saying, tell me more about what happened, just tell me more, things like that. Using the what word is great. What comments do you have about this rather than why did you do it? What feedback do you have for me about the situation? So the word what is really, really good. Really good. Let me see if we have time. Yes. Oh, okay. I'm just going to go ahead and say these really quickly. At the end of feedback, many of us have a habit of saying this. Does that make sense? Or, do you understand? Now, does that make sense? Do you understand? Jump in your chat box, go positive, neutral, or negative for me. Does that make sense? Do you understand? Alicia, oh, you're good. So the majority is neutral, negative. We've got a couple positives in there. Now, the intent of those two lines is very, very good. You want to make sure that there's understanding. One of the things to think about, and we talked about this, let me just pop us back real quick, is right here on the close, ensure there's understanding and ask them to sum up for you. What are your next steps? Based on the conversation that we had, how are you going to handle this? I want to make sure, and this is one of the ones that's my favorite, I want to make sure we're on the same page about what's going to happen next. Go ahead and sum up for me what your action steps are. So that's one that's easier for me to say. I want to make sure we're on the same page. So that's a great way to start that conversation at the very end. Have them wrap that up. I want to make sure we're on the same page here. Can you go ahead and tell me what this is? Now, someone's asked me sometimes before, what if I get back to my desk and I send them a quick email summing everything up? Well, that's me summing it up. And also it can diminish their engagement during the conversation. So I would resist the temptation to sum up all your conversations in email. Now, if you'd like them to sum it up in email and send it to you, that sounds great. That sounds great as long as it's them summing it up. So let me go back here. We've got a couple more minutes. So before I get to reflect, let me just ask what kind of questions might be out there about giving feedback. Go ahead and jump into the chat box and see if there are any questions right now. So we've got a couple of people typing. All right, as they're typing, I'm going to go ahead and show us the reflect screen. What we're talking about here is this. After I give feedback, the way for me to help my growth is to actually reflect on the conversation and just ask yourself these very simple questions. Now, also, all of you will be getting the slides after this presentation and also a recording of this webinar too. So you'll have this, you'll receive this. So who talked more during the conversation? And you can see here with developmental, it would be this. With directive, it would be that. What was the how did I use my questions during the conversation? Did I collect the information and solve it myself? Did I want to do that? So these 5 questions will help you reflect on how did I do in that conversation? Did it go the way that I wanted it to go? And when I say that, did it go the way I wanted it to go, it doesn't necessarily mean did I get the outcome, the answer I wanted, because if we're doing developmental, we want to create thinking and we want to be open to their answers. We want to be open to their answers. It may not be exactly the way we would do it. It'll get it accomplished, and they have buy-in. So being open to that. So let me see what questions we have here. I have the hardest time providing feedback on indirect put-downs in group conversations. Not sure why I struggle with it. I appreciate suggestions. So indirect put-downs in group conversations. So you're in a group, and someone does that passive-aggressive little thing. One of the biggest a great thing to do is, and I'm sure this is something you've thought of, do a separate conversation and ask, I'm curious. I heard you say XYZ, and I, not you, but I heard this, and I'm curious about that statement. And the reason is because I felt the feel of the conversation go negative. So talk to me a little bit about that. So, I heard this. I'm curious about why that was said, and I felt the conversation going negative. Tell me what's behind that behind that comment. So things like that. Let's see. I require my team to send a recap of coaching sessions. Should I be so direct with that approach? I want to make sure that they are understanding my expectations and feel as though, some of them feel as if it's homework. So if you do it every single time, then it absolutely will feel like homework. There are some times when this will influence trust if we do it every single time. So there are some times when it's really important, hey, I want to make sure we're on the same page. When you get back to your desk, will you send me an email? And so we've got it both documented on what you're doing. So that type of approach, I'd be careful about doing it every time because that can impact the trust. And sometimes just let them go ahead. Once they verbally summed it up for you, fantastic, and they go on their way. And then notice if it's actually going well. So just be careful about doing it every time. I'm glad that you're having them do it. What about when we are laying out objectives for an individual and we want to ensure no gray areas as they can't leave room for misinterpretation? If they summarize for us and they consistently don't seem to be getting the full picture, what's the correct method for, very nice. So if they sum up and then at that point, it's very important to say, we are on different pages. And it's fine to go ahead and interject and say, I heard that we were going to go in this direction, da 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 da. And so, and then ask a question. So tell me about that direction, or tell me how I might have misstepped there on that. And again, seek to understand. Seek to understand. Feedback is transparent. It's a transparent conversation. Let's see. You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. I think we're good. And we are 2 minutes over. So thank you all so much. And let me show you here. If you have more questions, feel free to just send an email at info@bonfiretraining.com. And remember, humans crave feedback, so go for it. Thank you all so much. I had a great time. Thank you. Thank you.